Good morning, everybody, and welcome back to the Bid Breakfast. It's the Q&A session today. I am joined by Rob. Good morning, Rob.
Good morning.
And as you will have noticed, Chris is missing from the screen today. Chris is on holiday. So, Chris, I'm sure you will have tuned in to listen to this. I hope you're having a great holiday. So let's get on to our first question. For those of you that are regulars, we have taken the news out. We've got a new development with the news, so just watch this space on that one. And we're just going to simply focus on the questions for this session. So this is one that we didn't get to last time, and I'm not quite sure who wrote it. Not that matters, but it's a really interesting question here, which is, what sort of score can I expect if I write a bid in the last week? Now, my initial response to that was awful. But having thought about it a little bit, Rob, I think there's maybe a couple of different answers to this. One is if you are completely unprepared and you write a bid in the last week, it's probably not going to do that well. What I then started to think about was, if you are an experienced bid writer who's worked in a business for a long time and knows the business inside out, then maybe you could actually produce something semi-reasonable. And then I got to thinking, I remember a bid that we worked on where you spent an awful lot of time planning and then wrote a bid in a couple of days. Well, it's certainly the first draft, which was a decent first draft. So on face value, I thought this is going to be awful, but there are maybe circumstances where writing a bid in a week could lead to a reasonable result. I don't know what your thoughts are on that.
Yeah, apologies for my smiling and muteness. The ice cream van decided to come around at exactly this moment as the Bid Breakfast started. So if you do hear green sleeves in the background, that's why. Yeah, it's a tricky one. I think if the information exists, if the bid is of a reasonable size, and you have a good bid team being able to work on it, you've got a reasonable chance. I still think you need access to an SME or relevant SMEs at short notice as well. So it is possible we have turned around decent bids or finished off decent bids in a week, but obviously it's never going to be best practice. I think to score, if we're saying it's out of 5, if you're going to be wanting to score for at least 4s out of 5s, you need at least 2 weeks, I'd say, for any size of bid, because you've got to go through that iterative and layered process of the drafting and reviews, and that all takes time. So I think at least 2 weeks is required.
Yeah. So I guess, like, if you were really trying to compress this down and you actually knew what the business did, let's say a 10,000 word bid, you could maybe write that in a couple of days, a day's review, a day's polish, and a day's submission.
Yeah, you can. Not to be too doubting on this, but what that doesn't take into account is the thinking time required to develop good answers. Yep. Now, you might get, fantastic inspiration and be able to, churn it out really quickly, but you've got no give on that. You're relying on everyone to be on absolute peak form to get that bid done to a high quality in that space of time.
Yep. And I think this comes back to a lot of the stuff that we talk about, which is the pre-bid work and preparation. Now, this is obviously not an ideal scenario, and I wouldn't recommend anyone writes a bid in a week. But if you have to, I think it's definitely a team approach, as you've suggested, Rob. And ideally, a setup like we've got where you're in Australia, which is why there's an ice cream van around, because it's certainly not here at the moment, where you can work overnight as well. So you're almost effectively doubling the time. But hopefully that kind of answers that question of probably not great, but there is the odd circumstance where you might do okay. But I don't think I would recommend it. Okay, let's have a look at the next one then. Oh, this is a good question. So what is the biggest lesson you have learned in bidding?
You answer that one first. Let me have a think.
Okay. Well, I took quite a while to think about this, because there are lots of lessons that I've learned. I think probably the biggest one, and I tend to bid manage a lot of stuff, and you tend to write. So from a sort of bid management point of view, It was that bid managers are often not people's friends, because we're the ones that are asking for stuff on top of a day job, demanding stuff comes in at sometimes very challenging deadlines, pushing people into places where they don't want to go. And the biggest lesson I learned was being a lot more rigid with delivering on milestones and sticking to timelines. So I remember years ago, we were working with a client. They were under a lot of pressure. We were trying to be really supportive, slipping deadlines for them to help and just take pressure off. And where we got to at the end was a bid that came second by a few points, but some of that was down to the desire to try and help out and be nice people. Whereas if we'd have stuck to the process and pushed people harder, now that's not to say that wouldn't have had an impact, it would have probably got those extra few points. And within that lesson was also escalating things. So where things didn't happen on time was escalating that on the client side to say, look, this isn't telling tales, but this hasn't happened. We need this. It's a vital component of the bid to make sure that everything else happens. So I think that for me was the biggest lesson that I've learned, is be far more rigid with sticking to a process, and bid managers often don't have any friends.
I think for me, as a bid writer, it's knowing your limitations. I think that's important in any job, actually, and not being afraid to ask for help. It goes back to something we often say is about not working in isolation. Often, when I was younger as a bid writer, you were just put in a corner and, told to write it and hope for the best. And, especially when you're young, and if you don't have that support around you, I think, frankly, it's a waste of time what you're doing. As you get older, obviously, it's much easier to understand where your gaps are and discuss things. I mean, we talk every day, don't we? I definitely don't have all the answers. You don't have all the answers either. But we managed to develop it pretty well. And we know when to ask the client and the SMEs for those gaps in knowledge as well.
Yeah. We did just hear the ice cream van then. And of course, that sound for any children that might be watching the Easter holidays means that the ice cream's run out. So don't ask mum and dad for an ice cream.
Of course.
Yep. Right. So next question. How should I use freedom of information requests in my bid process? Right. Well, there's a multitude of different ways that this could be used. I think the first response to this would be sensibly. I know people that have submitted several hundred freedom of information requests. And what we have seen recently are responses coming back saying, we don't think this is in the public interest to release this information, it's for commercial gain. And there are certain councils that have a very well developed response to this that is consistent, that basically say, you're not doing this out of the good of your heart, this is for you to benefit as a business, so we're not releasing the information. But I think genuinely, if you are going to use these, this should be in terms of pre-bid work, and that would be to understand what buyers, commissioners want, what the headaches are, what the current spend levels are on contracts, so you can develop some competitive pricing that means that the public sector get value for money, and that you can properly prepare for a bid that's coming up or a framework application. So nobody wants to see a bad bid go in. The more and more bids that go in, the more and more competitive the process is, and the better value for money the public sector should get. So I think that's the big driver for this, is making sure that you are offering an alternative to what's already out there if you're new into the market or don't currently hold any contracts. But also, if you are an incumbent provider, you should know most things about a contract. However, it may well be a contract where there are multiple providers or a framework. So again, there might be other angles that you want to come out from in terms of asking for information, but essentially that should be used pre-bid to develop a solution that benefits the buyer and the customer, is my kind of broad view on that.
I think you can also use it again in pre-bid to maybe find out more. I mean, particularly for councils, you can probably find out a lot more about what's going on there. And it may be that you ask questions that are less direct and more around the subject. Maybe asking about spend with suppliers, who they're spending that money on. If they don't have a social value policy published, ask them if they have any priorities. They should. Environmental targets, all that kind of extra stuff that could, if it's not already out there or easy to find, could help influence how you're going to go about it.
Yeah.
I mean, we haven't really talked about it, but there's, I don't think in anything we've really done recently, but obviously councils have been struggling in some places and have gone bankrupt. Now, maybe some of those freedom of information requests could help you see where some of these councils are that you're looking at. Are they going to have any money to spend on your fantastic added value and innovations? Or are they just going to want the bog standard? This is, we have to do this and get through it, rather than something a bit whizzy that you can do. See, what we didn't mention is the best place that I know of anyway to ask the freedom of information request is, what do they know? And that has an index of all the asked questions and responses that have gone through it as well. So another way you can do have a look is see what's already been asked and look at the information, and often there can be a few nuggets of information there.
Yeah, I think that's a good point. Right? I completely forgot about that actually, but I don't know how many thousand requests have already gone in and are captured there. So that's definitely worth it. And it's quite interesting reading. I think the last time I started looking for something, I ended up down a rabbit hole of something else because I'd seen something that was of interest and started to look at that. But okay, hopefully that's answered that question. Okay, here's one. This is probably one for you from a writing point of view, but what is storyboarding?
Yeah, this the first time I ever saw this phrase, I honestly thought somebody was doing this as like a comic book style with pictures. I had no idea as a novice bid writer what on earth this meant. Essentially, storyboarding is planning your answer. I don't know why some people call it storyboarding. I always use the term planning or structuring, planning and structuring. It's just, for me, it's writing out notes and ideas under each heading as you go along. Now, we've discussed before, Matt, where sometimes we write out the what, how, why, when headings as well, which give even more structure. So storyboarding is a really important part of the process. Take your time with it. I mean, won't go into too much detail on our process, but we'd usually recommend spending about a quarter of your time actually planning, storyboarding, whatever you want to call it, your answers, and getting that detail in there. It will make your drafting so much easier down the line.
And I think the other thing it does is really highlight where gaps are. So when you do that plan, most of the time you've got a fairly good idea of what it might look like, but it really does hit you in the face when there's a gap. Yeah,
and I think I can safely say the more time we spend planning, storyboarding our answers, the better they generally are.
Yeah. And I think the other thing with this is it really helps to understand what the delivery model is or the product offer is to inform this, because when you try and storyboard without really understanding what it is that's going to be delivered, it's difficult. And that's when gaps, and you sort of, is it this?
You can still do a skeleton. You still kept saying do a skeleton. And because there's no harm when you're storyboarding going, I don't know the answer to this.
Sure.
And the whole point of you putting that there is you need to find it out, or it's highlighting to somebody else that it is a real priority that they need to get on with it.
Yeah, definitely. And I think that is a really important message, is it shouldn't stop. Even if you've just got a very, very light structure, you should still at least put that on the page. And one of the most painful things that I've seen in bidding was probably about 5-6 years ago. And a subject matter expert had been asked to write some content, and they only had to write a page. And we were both in the same office, and she sat there getting more and more stressed as the day went on, completely unable to write anything. By lunchtime, nothing had been written. By the afternoon, the stress levels had gone through the roof. Still nothing had been written. And so we were just working with this client. I'd been told to stay out of the way, not to get involved. And by the end of the day, still nothing had been written. So that was completely unproductive time. It put an undue amount of stress on that person. Nothing was achieved at the end of the day. And the reason that nothing was written, because she was so worried about people judging her work. And actually, if she just put a few points down on the page and started to build around them, then it would have made life a lot easier and not worry about what it looked like. The other really interesting article I read on LinkedIn this week was someone with writer's block. And what they did was just a bullet point. Any thoughts? Go away, have a cup of tea, walk around the garden, come back and build off a bullet point. And it was really interesting to hear how people do that. And I think that is a really key lesson, is don't get paralyzed by whatever it is that's going on in your head. At least get something on the page. And then, as you said, Rob, coming back to a team approach, give it to someone else, let them build on it, critique it, help you, discuss it. I mean, the discussions that we had yesterday around service model it really got a few sort of cogs going in my head and joined a few dots.
Well, I suppose there's another question in this as well, is storyboarding individually or storyboarding as a group, or storyboarding both, for that matter.
Yep.
I think it's always easier if somebody has done it to start with, to give something for people to discuss. And it could be that bid writer or whoever's done that initial storyboarding, then it goes to a group to discuss. And that's much easier to build upon and go from. Starting with a group from a blank sheet of paper, we've all been there.
Yep.
It's not fun.
Okay, let's move on to the next one then. So it's a shame Chris isn't here for this. What is an invitation to negotiate?
An excellent question. Just quickly, because you know more about this than I do, the first ever bid I worked on was an invitation to negotiate 15 years ago, and that's what I thought all bids were. And I've only worked on about 2 since.
Yeah, they do seem to be a lot rarer, and they generally speaking are for high value complex projects where the initial solution might not be nailed down because of the level of risk around the project. It might need a conversation. So as a general rule of thumb, these are longer processes, anything from sort of 6 months to 12 months, maybe even longer. There tends to be a limited number of bidders because of the complexity of the project, and that might just be that there are only certain people qualified to take on the work, or people have been invited based on their track record. But the ones that I've worked on generally are a mix of a written submission at various points and then negotiation meetings, which are basically conversations with the buyer. So all the ones I've worked on have either been 2 or 3 stages of negotiation. So it's first of all started with a written response. So you will submit a number of questions or responses to questions to the buyer. There will then be a series of meetings where you can go in. I've seen very structured ones where each meeting has a particular topic. So a very well structured one from a few years ago, there was a finance meeting, there was a governance meeting, there was an operations meeting, and so on. Others are more general conversations, and the whole response is dealt with in one go. It seems like a really nice way to work with buyers, but what came out in one of the first ones I worked on was it's also a really easy way to trip yourself up if you don't understand the rules. So I think it was the second one I worked on, the ask from the buyer was that you throw in all sorts of great ideas and this, that, and the other, and bring all your innovation into negotiation meeting 1. But those ideas might be shared with other bidders to improve the spec. So you've got to take a really guarded view on what you disclose at the various stages and whether that will or will not be shared. But it does make the process much easier from a bidding point of view to arrive at a solution that suits the client completely. It's a long process and it's very resource intensive. I know, like the one that we did the back end of last year, Rob, the big construction one. I mean, the team on that must have been 40 people. The man that went into it must have been in the thousands. So it's essentially an ITT, but with negotiation stages in, is the simplest way. There will be a technical way to describe it, but from a sort of practical point of view, think of submitting your first, second, and third draft of an ITT with a chance to talk to the buyer.
Oh, I think you talked about the man hours involved. In fact, in all the ones we've worked on, you've got to think very carefully about whether you're going to put everything into this, because obviously there's a chance that you won't win it. So if you're going to go through an invitation to go negotiate, there's no half measures. You really have to go for it, because the other bidders are likely to be putting everything into it.
Yep. Okay. Right, this is definitely one for you. I am an AI novice, but interested in experimenting with it to help with bid writing. Can you recommend where to start? I'll throw this entirely over to you.
Yeah, it's an interesting question. I think before you start using it for bid writing, I think what you need to do is see what programs are out there. You need to experiment with the programs themselves. Now, I'm not going to go into data security and all of that at the moment, but you do need to be mindful of that if you're using any confidential information. You need to be very careful and read the T's and C's without overusing. And obviously, we did a webinar with AutoGen the other week, which is a specific AI program for bid writing. I know there's a few others out there as well. That's at the high end. But if you're just an individual looking to see how it all works, the obvious place to start is to play around with ChatGPT. There is a free version. The premium version isn't that much money either. But I'd also recommend looking at the other things out there. Another very good one at the moment in terms of its creative writing, which is sometimes something we end up doing, is one that's called Claude. That's a very similar price to ChatGPT. And there are other ones out there like Perplexity, which is more around you ask it questions and it finds you lots of answers or provides inspiration and ideas. So experiment with the programs first, away from bid writing, to see about writing itself. But you also need to learn how to do prompting as well. You can't just go to an AI and go, write me an answer to this. It will write you something, but without enough nuance or information, it's not going to give you something great. It might give you a very base template to start from, but you've really got to work on your prompting. There's all sorts of guides out there. Everyone has all sorts of different opinions, but I found the best way is to experiment yourself and try different things.
That just got my brain thinking, Rob, that prompting AI is a little bit like asking the right questions in a capture session. If you don't ask the right questions, you don't get the right information, which means you can't write the response. Yeah, I think there's we're fascinated with AI and how it's going to work with bid writing, and it's moving at quite a pace.
I don't think anyone's nailed what's called prompt engineering for bid writing. Anyway, I could talk about it for a long time. We'll move on.
I mean, the only other thing just to note is when we did the webinar at the back end of last month was the PPN that was just released.
Yes.
And some of the guidance in there, and it is guidance, that buyers maybe should ask bidders who's used AI and how they've used it. So that's not to say that people who write bids with AI will be excluded. They certainly won't at this stage, but it is definitely worth looking at that PPN.
Yeah, definitely.
Okay, right. Now this is a good one, Rob. Who is the best person to lead a bid?
First question, what do you mean by lead?
Well,
I mean, what does the question mean by lead? Is that depending on the size of the bid and all sorts, you go all the way up to a bid director or a responsible person that oversees it at a very high level, or are we talking about a bid manager like yourself who's essentially project managing it?
I mean, my take on this, because obviously there could be multiple, is the actual kind of day-to-day running of the bid. And I think this one came in last night, and I sort of thought about this just before bed, thinking there's all sorts of different people who might be useful to lead a bid. So certainly there needs to be someone who's got a very good understanding of process. But I think the main thing for me, and also being creative with solutions and various other things, but the main thing that came to me was that it needs to be somebody that can get everybody on board and and drive people forward as a team. And that was the one sort of thing that I thought was probably the most valuable. So everybody can learn how to manage a process, to write a process. Everyone can learn how to write and come up with solutions. It's very difficult to learn how to motivate people and to pull a team together. Now, you can learn that, but I think it's one of those things that people either have or have developed over time, and probably playing a lot of sports, you've got that, whether you've been a team captain or a player, and you understand the dynamics of a team. But I think that's one of the most important things, is someone that can get the best out of people. And also that kind of then leads on to making the experience a positive one. So I've worked on bids where it's been absolutely awful. You get to the end of the bid, everyone wants to kill each other. People are probably not in the best of health. People haven't slept, there's stress, there's all sorts of stuff going on. But actually the bids that have been led by someone who can bring everyone together for a common purpose, keep people motivated. I know when we did the Big Breakfast bio with Rich Bailey, and he explained serving to lead, and it was about looking after people, making sure the well-being's okay. I thought that was a really good thing that fed into this. So I would say, if we were just picking one thing, was someone that can get that team together and get the best out of it. Everything else can be learned.
Yeah, I think you've probably touched on it already, but it's that element of getting people to do things that they often don't want to do, particularly SMEs, reviewers, and getting it in the right way. I've worked with bid managers, particularly in the past, where they've sent emails to SMEs or reviewers and have never followed that up, and they've literally just held their hands up and well, I've done what I meant, what I was meant to do.
Yeah.
I think the best person to lead a bid, I think, is that serve to lead. It is that the willingness to go above and beyond to get through the project. It's all deadline based. It's all high pressure. It's all about getting through to the end with the best quality product possible.
Yeah. And I think that just reminded me of a conversation we had yesterday, which was around that we care about what we do and the actual end product. And obviously, most people that work in bidding like to win. Otherwise, it's not a very nice place to work. But it also comes back to, having one eye on the end goal, which is a really high quality bid. Now, it might not be a winning bid, but if it's a bid that's the best it could be based on the pricing and what you had in place, you couldn't have done any better.
Yeah.
So whilst you haven't won, there'll be lessons that you can take from that as to how you can improve, but there's nothing else you could have done. So I think also that person who gets the best out of the team has to really care about the end product. Okay, we are pushing towards 9 o'clock, but wow, this might be one for next week. Okay, so this is a really interesting question and a huge area. How do I turn what we do into a bid solution? I might just quickly set this up for next time, but I don't think we've got enough time to really answer this today. So
I'm just going to go in here quickly.
Okay.
Our methodology, which is what, how, why, when. Well, take whatever you do, go through that methodology. So, what do you do? Fine. Absolutely fine. You can easily put that in a sentence. And talk through each element of how you do that. I think it is the same principle, really, and then going to why you do it and when you do it. I think we've done this before, Matt, where we've turned this into a nice process diagram as well.
Yeah.
Sometimes it's easier for people to have something visual, but I think you could follow that principle with anything. Yeah,
definitely. And in terms of the actual overall solution, then maybe, because at the what, how, why, when, we tend to use at question level, don't we? So maybe as a whole solution, you could take that up to a high level.
I think you do it at an overall level, and then you'd also use that methodology and breaking it down into any individual components of that as well.
Yeah. Okay. Right. But we'll definitely come back to this one in a fortnight's time and really get into the detail of that, because I think there are some really important points that kind of take the factual stuff that into a real solution for the customer. Okay, we're into the last minute, and again, I think this is probably one for next time, but we'll just whet people's appetite. So with local and a potential general election this year, what does this mean for public sector procurement? And hopefully Chris will be back for that one. So we may well get Chris to give a view on procurement. Rob, I know you have a fascination with politics, and I keep an eye on things, so I'm sure that will be a really good debate to listen to. We are pretty much at 9 o'clock. There's a final question on NHS provider regime, which again we'll pick up and links into this month's webinar around the NHS. As always, thank you for watching. Yeah, the next episode will be the 24th of April. Hopefully we've answered all those questions. Thank you for those people that joined us. Enjoy your day at work today, and we will see you next time.
Thanks all.